Hello, everyone. My name is Jobin Kuruvilla. I'm the head of solution strategy at Adaptavist. And today we have a group of principal DevOps consultants with me. And we are going to talk about the changing landscape of DevSecOps in the land of consultancy. Hey, consultants here. Do you want to introduce yourself? I will pick on Jason Spriggs.
I'm Jason Spriggs. I'm one of the consulting leads over here at Adaptavist, mainly focusing on the DevOps world.
All right. Thank you, Jason. Peter.
Hi, I'm Peter Daugavietis. I'm based out of Canada, actually. Here at Adaptavist now for about 3 years and concentrating definitely on DevOps, cloud, and the like.
Thank you, Peter. And that leaves us with Tim.
Hi, Timothy here, and been with Adaptavist for almost, or probably just over 1 year, focusing on DevOps, infrastructure as code, and configuration as code as well. So, yep.
Thank you, Tim. So you guys are all had been working in the DevOps area for quite long. Now the term DevSecOps has become quite popular. Actually, that reminds me, in one of the break talks, we were talking about what is really the term. Is it DevSecOps, SecDevOps? Should it be just SecOps? Any thoughts on that?
I'll jump in first, I guess. Both feet. I think it kind of depends on the company and what your primary focus is in some ways. Adding security elements to DevOps would tend to leave itself more DevSecOps, but SecOps itself is really security operations, and that's its kind of own, I guess, almost subset of DevOps in a way. So where the two cross over is where I would say it's more DevSecOps, and then SecOps itself is a little bit more security focused for security's sake.
Tim, Jason, feel free to jump in if you want to add something else.
Okay, so from my perspective, SecOps, yes, it is a thing that a full operations team is taking care of, in a sense that making sure that the security, whether it's normally it's on the infrastructure side of things, right, is shift left with, and then it becomes a DevSecOps, right? It becomes a part of DevOps, and when SecOps tries to shift left.
That's interesting. Shift left, that's a term that we hear so often these days, right? So what exactly is shift left? There's a lot of customers probably wondering about this. Jason, do you want to speak to it?
Yeah, so generally trying to shift left your processes is just having it and the conversations regarding, in this case, security sooner on in the development and project planning process. That's the general gist of it. So making sure that when you are developing software or going through your product development, you have security-minded tools and processes earlier on so you catch things before they might spiral into separate projects.
Now, we all know there is definitely a hype around DevSecOps these days, right? Have you really seen a change in the way security is perceived in the recent days by our customers? Is DevSecOps really on the rise, or is it just, some numbers coming out of the service?
I think that it's definitely on the rise, and it can't do anything but make everything better in terms of more secure pipelines, more secure pathways, more secure applications in general, mostly because of all those, and I like to call them resume generating events that you hear about in the news about, this data leak or that data leak, or, who knows whatever else, outages that are caused by, oopsies that are relatively easily done or easily taken care of ahead of time. So I think the bigger part of that is it's, if nothing else, even if you may not be actioning a lot of these things, it's making the awareness level go up, where, developers are going to be aware of using like HTTPS instead of HTTP, or encryption at rest in databases and file storage. And just the awareness is definitely on the rise, which is an excellent thing all around in my thoughts.
Yeah, I'd also, just to add on to that, I think having developers be more mindful of the infrastructure that their code is running on. So similarly, either in the Kubernetes space, making sure that they're developing for a particular ingress type, or if they're using Amazon or a different cloud provider, they're using and expecting that their service is going to be behind a load balancer or a WAF, and ensuring that they're developing with those practices in mind.
It was interesting when Peter was talking about resume generating events, right? Because there's always going to be failures in production. There's always going to be failures in real world, right? We cannot really blame an individual for those failures. I mean, that's a really bad practice. I remember one of the biggest companies, I forgot which one it was, Amazon or one of those companies was saying there was an outrage in production, but we cannot actually pin it on an individual, and we don't want to pin it on an individual, because the point is, if that individual could do something as big, it's a failure of the process itself, right? It's not a failure of that individual. So in my opinion, it should never be a resume generating event. It should be, for the organizations to concentrate more on security, the actual implementation of detail, whichever event that was.
Yeah, and I mean, I said that a little more tongue in cheek than it may have come across initially, but you also touch upon one of the more important aspects of DevOps in general, where you get that the idea of blamelessness. We're all one team. We either pass or fail together, and you really don't need to worry about casting blame. Let's just find the fault and fix it. And I think that's another thing, that security in general, as soon as you use even the word security, it conjures images of some guy that's about 8'10" and carrying a very large stick, and I'm security and I'm going to be here now to make sure that things don't go bad. And I think, again, through awareness, through all the different DevOps practices and DevSecOps practices that can come in, that kind of stereotype, those kind of thoughts, all of that is going to be shifted left, and hopefully shifted left right off the table. So that's a good thing.
That's a beautiful way to put it, right? Blamelessness.
Right. So yeah, DevSecOps is, of course, to wrap it up, I think, well, not to wrap it up, but it's to help, the developers or the security engineers, right, to fix the security vulnerabilities as soon as they enter the CI/CD process.
So what are we actually seeing in the real world? Is it only happening alongside cloud migrations? Because ever since companies started moving to cloud, they became more aware of the concept of security, right? Are we seeing that? Are we seeing it mostly around cloud migrations, or are we seeing implementation of DevSecOps even on-prem?
I think it's both. I've definitely seen it in both. One of the easy paths to daylight is if you already have a pipeline of some sort, whether it's cloud or on-prem. It's relatively simple to start layering in some level of security scanning, vulnerability scanning, dependency scanning, all those kind of things as part of your automated build systems, as part of your testing systems, all those kind of things. And you can absolutely do that, whether it's in the cloud or on-prem. The ability to do it is pretty much the same. I think the nice thing with moving to cloud is that it does give you an opportunity to refactor and rethink the way you do things. And so it may come along for the ride a lot easier in terms of cloud migrations and stuff, because we're doing such a holistic change of, yanking, lifting, shifting, who knows, whatever process and you decided to follow for that. But It certainly allows you probably a little bit more leeway to factor that into the transition, as opposed to trying to nickel and dime it sometimes into existing systems or existing projects or existing OpEx type budgets.
That is a very good point, especially when you mentioned about, re-architecting while migrating to cloud. Does that make sense to do that when you start implementing DevSecOps? Because most of the time, we only care about, let's just add a few more stages into the pipeline, right? But does it make sense to maybe take a step back, look at what the current process is, and right, we are going to implement DevSecOps. Maybe this is a good time to, look at the solution as such and re-architect some of the things, similar to what we do when we migrate to cloud?
Yeah, I think I can provide an example for that. For one of the companies that I'm working with, they are one of the largest makeup companies. So they're doing a re-architect from more of a on-prem legacy code base to something with using Netlify and GitHub, right? So we've taken the opportunity to not only re-architect the platform from something like a Drupal to more of a React-based TypeScript development. And we've also taken the opportunity to implement security processes into the CI/CD flow. For example, tools like Dependabot, Snyk, SonarQube, Sentry. So some of these are static scanning, some of these dynamic scanning against the code base. So yeah, so that's one of the examples of a company that we're working with to implement these features.
Nice to hear. I heard a lot of tools names in there, right? And we know that in the DevOps world, tools are as important as the people and the processes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So do you think, what are some of the tools our customers are using? And how are these tools, like maybe like GitLab, one of our partners, making it easier for practicing DevSecOps? The reason I'm asking is, in the past, we know that implementing security into the pipeline was a really, really hard thing to do, because you had to integrate with multiple systems and the integrations were really, really complex, right? But in the modern day, ever since DevSecOps became the new talk in the town, I see that a lot of the tools are actually embracing that change and making it easier for us to implement DevSecOps. Is that right? Have you seen that happening?
Yes, we've seen that happening. So for example, with one of our partners, GitLab, their tool, they have developed a platform or a solution called Autodevops. So Autodevops provides, it's just a simple import of a YAML file, where you would include that YAML file into your CI/CD process, and it would take into account the type of deployment that you are making, right? Whether it's a straight off deployment or a Docker file, a container, or just a static deployment. It would understand and try to cover things like dynamic DAST, right? SAST, static security scanning, and such. So yeah.
Jason, I think you were going to say something. I saw you coming off of mute.
That was almost exactly what I was going to say. So.
Super. It looks like we are in agreement. But speaking about integrations, again, so we saw how GitLab is making it easier with the help of Autodevops, in which most of the things are happening in GitLab itself, right? But our company is also making it easier to maybe integrate with third-party solutions, bringing in all the best-in-class tools. Like, for example, Atlassian, right? With its open DevOps, it's already integrating with a lot of security tools. It's integrating with tools like GitLab. So I see a shift in the way vendors are doing things as well?
I think one of the biggest shifts in general, and it's really kind of taking root with security, SecOps integration into things, but just a general level of integration into things, and especially when you're moving to cloud, the rise of the API, and the fact that if you don't have an API, or application programming interface is what it stands for, if you don't have one for your tool, odds are it's probably not going to get used that much. And the big thing with a lot of the tools that are coming out now is that they have a very effectively rich API that you can call either with through REST or through regular HTTP calls, or some level of other interface that makes it available, in order to be consumed by anybody who wants to integrate to it. And I think one of the biggest ones is the CVE lists and stuff, or critical vulnerability, lists like that are then in turn integrated into, or rather integrated by all the different scanning tools, so that they know what to scan for, they know what to report, they know that, okay, I have how many critical vulnerabilities, I've got so many major vulnerabilities, and through that you're able to triage and start making decisions of, I need to tackle these criticals now because those are the ones on the news, and the minor ones because, I don't know, the formatting is off, or this module that's used by one tool that helps me format a file extension or something is old. Well, okay, that's a minor one, I can leave that one for next time. But you're also then able to start integrating into all these tools, getting the information back out of them, and making good decisions, and much better decisions in terms of what gets planned into the work, what gets it's a lot more not reactionary, but or rather reactive, but proactive. So you get that kind of thing. So
I can relate to that, because especially when you talk about the CVE list, I mean, I've been a developer before. We all probably were, right? And as soon as you bring in a third-party library, and if due to the shift left and all these tools integrated tightly with the CVE list, as soon as you bring it in, you can actually see, oh my God, oopsie, because I can see that my build failed with 10 different vulnerability issues, and that actually helps me plan now, rather than take it all the way to staging, and then the security guy comes and knocks on my door saying that, did you know that this actually introduced 10 different vulnerabilities, right?
Yeah, when the security guy asks for your resume, no, this is not. No.
Well, I heard Tim speaking about SAST and DAST. Obviously, people like us know what it is, but for the sake of our listeners, can somebody explain what's the difference between SAST and DAST is, and what we are seeing in terms of how our customers are implementing it?
So SAST stands for Static Application Security Testing. And what that is basically the scanning of files and the scanning of the source code without it having to be a compiled artifact or a running website or anything like that. So it basically scans all through the code, all through your code base at static file time. So it just basically, the files are sitting there, but I can tell, if you do this in Java, for instance, you open up a massive security hole because of A, B, and C.
Right.
DAST is its counterpart, Dynamic Application Security Testing. And that's the one that actually will go through and test and check your code at runtime. So now let's say that you've got a web-based application that you've deployed to dev. You can now apply a DAST tool, or write your own stuff, and again go through those steps. But it actually then, during the exercising of your source code at execution time, it's going to go through and scan for vulnerabilities. So are there extra ports open by accident? Are there protocol issues? Are there different different configurations? things like the classic SQL injections. If I type my name as double quote $, question mark, delete all from table star, those kind of things. So that, yeah, basically it's scanning the application when it's not running, scanning the application when it is running.
That clarifies it. But that also means that there is a cost for doing DAST, because I need to have an environment where the application is running, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that then brings up the question, okay, how easy it is to implement it. I mean, is it going to be like a static environment which leaves there where DAST will be done, or are there going to be ephemeral environments where, I spin up an environment dynamically, right? Do the dynamic application security testing and then spin it down as soon as that is done.
So for a lot of those types of environments, you would want to use a tool like GitLab that would either stand up a new environment per branch or commit, or in every release, whatever you might want the cadence to be. So generally that would either happen automatically, or you could use your CI/CD tools to go ahead and do that. And then once you have those running, if you're using some sort of framework that you're developing in with, Spring Boot comes to mind as a pretty major one that has good DAST tools already out there. You can run a set of queries that are already against it for known vulnerabilities that will go through and check to make sure you have various headers aren't being misinterpreted, or if you're running your production variables, it will actually be using things that are more secure than what your devs might be using. So things along those lines.
Yeah. You can scale up, like DAST can get very complex and very, pricey, if you will. Because there are companies out there too, like IBM has one that the name escapes me, but I know there's things like Checkmarks as well, which is a very well-known name out there, that will go in and very much like APM tools, it will instrument your application through bytecode manipulation and a few other things, and that kind of thing, and actually then keep track of whether it's SQL injection problems, or, as Jason mentioned, header issues, or just bad code sometimes. I know I've been accused of that myself in the past, which is why I'm now on the more admin side of things and not developing as much.
Now, quite honestly, this all sounds a bit scary, right? So the question is, should the organizations wait until they reach a certain maturity level before they start implementing DevSecOps? Now, the reason I ask is, Peter, I know that we do the DevOps maturity assessment quite a lot in organizations, right? We have seen customers ranging from, a beginner maturity level to an expert. I don't even remember the stages that we call it. You can explain that, Peter. But we have seen customers ranging from different maturity levels, right? Should they wait until they reach a particular maturity level before they start implementing DevSecOps?
So I'd say no. And honestly, if you have the opportunity to achieve that sooner when your company is smaller and your engineering teams are smaller, where there are fewer stakeholders, the better. Just because it is much easier to get everyone on the same page, thinking with a security mindset, and have that all be something that's sort of a part of your process, and you can grow with that in mind. But even with that, I think not necessarily jumping directly into DevSecOps, but more SecOps, even if you aren't necessarily at the level of DevOps readiness that you might expect an organization to potentially be at, starting to have those conversations and making sure that they're involved in the decision making is certainly going to help make and drive those decisions.
All right. Now, I'm going to say that the size of the company or the size of the team doesn't really matter in terms of the maturity level, right? Because you can have a startup which is highly matured versus an enterprise which is, at a lower maturity level in terms of implementation of DevOps. Now, the reason I was asking was, if the company doesn't even have any CI/CD pipelines implemented, maybe it is too early for them to implement DevSecOps, right? Maybe they should start creating a few pipelines before starting to inject security checks into the pipeline. What do you think?
No, in a word. I don't think having pipelines makes it a lot easier and more straightforward to integrate everything into, because it gives you that single central place that that I can go from here, and I can now attach to this thing, the other thing, whatever, different applications, different integrations.
Right.
Security is very much, and to Jason's point, I think, is that you really want it to be part of the DNA of any organization, big, small, or anything else in between. And starting to add in at the process layer, because really a pipeline at the end of the day is just an implementation of a process. And so long as your process of development or your process of release or whatever includes some stage of let's do some checks to make sure we don't shoot ourselves in the foot, that's exactly where you want to be doing it. And again, in a very small team, in let's call it an immature team, that would be a manual step on, let's say, release, where release is technically much further to the right than you'd want to do it, but at least it's going to get done. And once you start building the pipelines, once you start having the automations in place, that allows you now to then start shifting left more and more and gain the benefits of the shifting left and of everything else. So I think from that point of view, I don't think it's ever too early to start worrying about security. I mean, it's you definitely don't want to have your company information, whether it's big, small, or anything in between, just out there on the internet for everyone to see. So security is kind of important from day one, I think.
Fair enough.
So in my opinion, it shouldn't be a big or small company, or hopefully less mature or more mature, right? We should all start thinking about security and implement it, as soon as possible, whether it is automated or not. So we could start with, if you're maybe less mature, maybe start with the easier things like container scanning and static scanning. And then as the team takes into account they're more mature, the CI/CD pipelines are there, we could bring up MF role environments to do automatic dynamic DAST scanning, right? Where the applications are deployed to MF role environments and they can be scanned accordingly. So that's,
All right, fair enough. Yeah. And I hear you, Peter. What you're saying is, start manually, maybe if you're not matured enough to put it into the pipeline, and when the time comes, start incorporating it in the pipeline as various different stages. That makes sense.
Right. There also, I would just throw in there, you don't, just because there is a scanning tool in the pipeline doesn't necessarily mean it has to hold up development. You can just have it for informational and have it just be streaming its logs somewhere and then review them at a later point. So you don't have to go all in with your process.
Yeah, right. A tool like Sneak is actually the one that kind of popped into my head for that, where you can have it scan your code repositories automatically, and it'll generate the reports and everything else, but they're put off to the side. So you can deal with them when you have time, as you have time. Unless it's a burning issue, then my suggestion would be that take care of the criticals, because they're marked critical for a reason. But it's something that can be done regardless of pipeline, regardless of size. Give it access to your GitHub repositories or your GitLab repositories, and it'll take care of itself. And it'll protect you against the simple things like somebody who committed a username and password for an AWS account into public repositories. And I've done that once. Only once. 4 companies ago, so I don't have to worry about it. But it's, and that the funny thing with the security and thinking about it is it's a lot of little practices that can start doing as well, like making sure that you don't commit passwords, making sure that you use at least something like base64 to obfuscate information if you need to. So if it's a text, it looks like junk, but at least it's easily figured out. Or just the little tiny practices of making code and making all your stuff better.
So now that we have established that security should be a priority irrespective of the maturity of the organization, right? Have you seen any friction between the different teams, like developers, operations, and the security team itself while implementing DevSecOps? I see you laughing, Peter, because we have seen that there are conflicting priorities for various teams. So is DevSecOps a problem while implementing DevSecOps? Is that a problem, or is it actually making lives easier for the different teams?
I think I can take that one. So again, going back to the customer that I have, the makeup company. So again, we are refactoring ourselves to a new technology stack, a new CI/CD tool. So for them, it's not a problem that we have introduced security, DevSecOps into the process, because they understand that it is a new world out there and they don't want to have any security issues. So then it boils down to a balance of whether those security issues are a blocker to these teams or not. So for example, the CVE, the latest CVEs that are, I believe there was one which was severe with a 9.7. Was it a blocker for the team or not? So at the moment, we made it a blocker if it's like a critical, and the development team accepts that they have to fix that security issue before the next release. For things like medium and minor or not accountable, not rated, so those kind of security issues are not a blocker for the next release. So yeah.
All right, that's very interesting. The reason I said interesting is, in my mind, whenever you start doing digital transformation, get on a DevOps journey, DevSecOps journey, or whatever it is, the biggest challenge is the cultural change, right? And we keep saying that in many of our meetings, the biggest change is to convince the customer that, hey, we have to do this as one team. So are we saying that DevSecOps, it becomes a little easier, or are there any challenges while implementing DevSecOps?
Well, the reason I was laughing earlier is, has everybody read the Phoenix Project? Because I think that gives an interesting take on what security and things are. Now, I think taking a step back, I think that classically, or call it in legacy worlds, security and audit were always left to the last minute. They were always kind of the orphan child of the process, and they'd come running in at the end going, wait, you can't do anything because this is important. And with the integration into the pipelines, with the integration into DevOps in general, I think that that's changing, and that's good, because putting those kind of thoughts into a more relevant, if you will, but a more front of mind approach to things. I also think that developers, and having been one, and much like yourself and all of us here, we don't like stuff getting in our way when we're on a roll, or so it feels. And so I think there's always going to be a little bit of grumbling and everything else, and especially with because people in general, then we don't like change. So everybody gets set in their ways, and this is the way I work, and whatever else. So there has to be a little bit of change, and through any change, you're going to get a little bit of friction. Now, the other thing that I think makes it easier in the long run is that we're all coming at it from a place of, we want to make things better. We're trying to make things more secure. We're trying to do the right thing, in quotes. I think that's the important thing to keep in mind. And even if there are conflicting, whether it's priorities or thought processes or anything else, again, with a more collaborative, and we talked about it earlier, the blameless environments of trying to get through and get a good plan in place and get a good product out the door. I think that's that biggest cultural shift that, I think in general, it should smooth things over, hopefully.
No, that makes sense. And I think it's all about, every team understanding that it's ultimately going to help them. Obviously, for the security team, it's putting security at the heart of everything. They like it. Even for developers and operations, to identify risk earlier so we don't have to wait until the end of the journey to, again, start working on it, starting from the beginning, right? So that actually helps developers and operations teams too. So yeah, makes total sense. I think as a consultant, the biggest challenge for us is to, let them know the benefits of doing it, right? And getting them on board with that journey. Right. So are there any metrics that we need to pay attention to while implementing DevSecOps? Any critical metrics that you can think of, or how do we find out if we are on the right track and if the implementation is making any difference? Right.
Well, I think the simplest one is how many CVEs do we have? And as Tim was mentioning earlier, what rating are they? What level are they? How critical are they? And even if then they are rated as a blocking chain or a blocking issue or whatever, do we actually use that aspect of it? When in a previous company we'd implemented container scanning, and the rule of the land was that if your collective score was over, I don't know, I think 20, then your container was not allowed into tests, much less production. And so you had to go through and you had to mitigate enough to get under the barrier. But it was also that if you got flagged because, and Java's terrible for this, for instance, where they include every library under the sun because you included Log4j or something like that. If you could determine that this CVE was flagged because you include the jar file, but you don't actually use that particular functionality, then you were given a pass and it was okay, and yada yada yada. So generally speaking, I would say the metrics are how many exceptions, how many faults, quote unquote, whatever, or CVEs are you subject to, and what important they are, or not important they are, but rather what rating they have.
How critical they are. Yeah.
Yeah. That would be the one that comes to mind. I don't know, Tim, Jason, you probably have a few others in mind.
From my experience, I believe there are many tools that does the security side of things, right? Again, whether it's SNCC or whether it is OWSP, Sentry, Sonar Cube, right? But I believe they generally all return a value of severity, whether ranging from critical, high, medium, low, info, unknown. So most of these tools return severities. So whether it's dependency scanning or security scanning, yep. So then it becomes a a threshold how much criticals has been fixed, has been reported, has been introduced high, medium, and low. So there is a certain threshold that every company should, every organization should invest in figuring what that number is, and making sure that certain numbers do not go up, certain numbers go down, and certain numbers maintain, like 0 introduced vulnerabilities, increase of resolve critical, right? A decrease of criticals. Yep.
Right, that makes sense. And especially with tools like GitLab coming up with these dashboards, which will then pull all these metrics right into your face, right? In front of all the stakeholders, not just security people. That makes life easier as well. So you can constantly monitor what's happening and keep an eye on where things are, right?
Yeah,
All
and
right.
I would just similarly say a lot of these tools, or there are alternatives to some of these tools that allow you to sort of do it passively. So things like if you're already uploading your containers to a container registry, a lot of them now have at least static code analysis tools that are already baked in. So you'll get a list with every container image that you upload of any vulnerabilities that are there. So you can do a one-to-one comparison of, does this change result in additional security holes? So just something to
That's
keep
a
in mind.
very good point. Yeah. Jason, since you're speaking, I'm going to send the next question your way. Have you seen any difference in implementing DevSecOps for larger versus smaller teams? Are there any differences at all in terms of the size of the team?
As far as the size of teams, not necessarily. I think the two biggest contributing factors are the amount of industry regulation that is around a specific organization and what guidelines they have to follow, because of security is just a practice that's already implemented inside of an organization. It's going to be taken more seriously, but also may have different implications for an organization, regardless of its size. Similarly, from an organizational standpoint, something that I've noticed at a number of companies is how closely tied together the engineering teams are with both the security teams and the product teams. Mainly in the resulting fact that obviously product wants a bunch of new features. They care about going fast and making market decisions, whereas the security team has very much competing things. So making sure that the engineering teams are able to weigh both of these and understand that while this doesn't necessarily have value to the business from a moving forward standpoint, there is certainly business value to fixing security issues.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I think that ties back to, you know, one of the whole concept of agile and agility, where agile is for planning purposes and everything else is, you know, very common and talked about with Scrum or Kanban or this or that or whatever. But one of the underlying concepts of that is also the idea of a cross-functional team. And that's where you've got a single team that has representation from you, like what Jason mentioned, the product team, the operations team, the developers, you know, hopefully security and everything else is included in that. And to that end, there's a really great book called Team Topologies that talks about team structures and how those all work. And I think the one thing from a size of the team, size of the company, is that it's much easier to have a cross-functional team with less people, because you have a certain threshold that you get to that you pretty much have to scale now. And a lot of the time it tends to be scaling not necessarily by product team or by having multiple cross-functional teams, but you'll start breaking out saying, well, no, that's my development team, that's my planning team, that's my operations team. And it kind of goes against everything that is spoken about in terms of agile and agility with cross-functionality. And so I think the one thing that I've noticed and I've seen before too, where you get up into the organizational level of enterprises, where you talk about the makeup companies, you talk about the banks, you talk about insurance companies, they all have dedicated teams for each piece of the puzzle, and they don't necessarily talk to each other all that well. And I think that's the tricky part to navigate, is the building of a cross-functional team, to making sure that you can have everybody kind of at the table, everybody's represented properly, so that you can, you know, share all those things among among the different members of the team, making sure that you see, you know, get security concerns from the security team, make sure you've got the audit concerns from the compliance team, making sure that you're still getting the information from the products team or from the business to drive the product team. But it's a little bit easier to implement, and I think Jason actually mentioned this earlier in the conversation too, where it's just easier with less people, because you get less competing opinions, less friction from, you know, different personalities and stuff like that. And so generally speaking, it's a little bit easier to kind of hit the ground running at the smaller size, whereas growing up into the enterprise now presents a lot of other organizational challenges, and you start factoring in Conway's law, and all that. The team structure becomes a trickier thing to navigate.
Good point. At Adaptavist, I know that we had been working with smaller companies as well as with big enterprises. With big enterprises, what I have also noticed is we probably start working with a few teams first, and then get them up to speed, and then slowly we start incorporating those processes with the other teams, right? Any thoughts on that? I mean, is that what the reality out in the world?
I think so. I mean, at least from what I've seen is, this speaks to the agile maturity and digital transformation, and everybody wants digital transformation. It's the current hot topic, buzzword, whatever you want to call it. And it's interesting that you really start factoring something like Conway's law that I mentioned, where the organizational or the team structure tends to follow whatever organizational structure is there for a given enterprise. And like I said, that's really, or can be really challenging to cross-functional teams and to getting to the goal line, if you will. I know I've seen both sides of that coin, where you smaller team is a little bit more, I won't say free of process, but there's less process and thing that has to be followed. Whereas some of the enterprises, especially fintechs and stuff, their processes and procedures are volumes thick, because at some point in 1963 somebody did something bad, and ever since then we've now had to follow this 22-step guide of how to turn on a light switch.
All right.
It's usually not quite that absurd, but yeah, anyway.
We get the point. Thank you, Peter. All right. In the interest of time, we'll just move on to the last question. We know that implementation of DevOps is costly, right? And the same could be, say, of DevSecOps, right? But how costly it is? I mean, we spoke about DAST and the requirement to spin up environments so we can do dynamic application security testing, right? But it also is about bringing in more tools, integrating it. Is it all worth doing it? Is there an option for me to say that maybe I should push implementing DevSecOps to maybe 2035 rather than 2025?
Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah. So cost, I suppose cost is not only about the tools and the resources that you spend learning those tools and implementing those tools, learning the processes to implement in your pipeline, right? Then we must also consider the cost of a security incident, right? Are we paying extra money for for teams, for developers, for security engineers over a weekend, right? Are we paying them like double or triple to these human resources to fix the issues over the weekend, right? Because we don't have those security processes in line. Then there are other costs. Are the regulators going to come after the organization if they do not meet those security requirements? For example, if information like PI gets exposed, that could be a huge, a bigger cost that could run in tens or hundreds of millions, right? So so when it comes to the cost, there's not only the cost of actually implementing it, but there's also the cost of a mistake. Yep.
And there is also the damages to the reputation, right? How many customers are you going to lose?
I was just about to say that, because really the way that you have to consider this is, and the way that I feel that you need to consider this is, you're basically buying trust insurance.
Right.
In a big way, where you have trust in your pipelines because you can see the metrics about them and you can see that they're healthy or whatever else. You have trust in your application security because you can see my CVE counts going down. We're using the proper TLS certificates. We're using the proper ciphers, all those kind of things. I trust in my systems because of the amount of testing that I do on them and everything else. And so you're building up that trust. And as you said, you have that trust with your clients, with your customers, where they know, like, if I go, I can trust a bank to keep my money safe as opposed to Uncle Fester's credit union on the corner, because, they have checks, balances, they have a proven track record. They don't have PII leaks. They don't have data breaches. Those kind of things. And that's a very tangible thing to keep in mind, that through the judicious use of and implementation of SecDevOps or DevSecOps. See, I always interchange them anyway. You're allowed, you get that trust, you build that trust, and in turn you build that quality. And if that trust is ever broken, it's next to impossible to get back. Because it only takes one straw to break that camel's back, and you're in the middle of the Sahara.
Very valid point. There's not much money you can put on that kind of a thing. And I think trust is definitely a value that we rate very highly at Adaptavist. I mean, if I am the customer, can I trust Peter, Jason, and team to implement the DevSecOps pipelines for me? Can I? I hope so.
Yes, you can.
There we go,
Tim and Jason for sure.
For sure. All right, Peter, let's not talk about you for now. But thanks a lot, guys, for being with me today in talking about DevSecOps and how we can help our customers implement DevSecOps and what is the current change in landscape of DevSecOps in the land of consultancy. It's nice having you here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.